Good day to you. I'm Kyte, and we're out here in our garden in Moraga. We're doing a series of short videos on dimensions of beauty in a California native plant garden. Today's topic is designing for beauty. And when I think of designing, I think of the months of January and February, when perhaps I'm most likely to get chased inside by the weather and maybe have more time to plan or think about what I want to do in the next growing season. So I guess the first question I have in design is, why even bother with design at all? Why don't we just stick plants in where we will and just see what happens? Well, I get the feeling some people do that, and you see gardens that are kind of hodgepodge or eclectic. Nothing ties together, and you say, I wonder what they were trying to do. Obviously, they could have benefited from a little forethought. But there's certain conditions that you have to keep in mind, whatever you're going to do with your landscape, and that is the climate or weather in your area. Certainly the soil, maybe the amount of slope, the direction of the slope, the size of your lot, the personal preferences that you have. They're all important. I think size, for example, the smaller the garden area you have, I think the greater the challenge. And I think if I had a very small area to plant in, I would delve more into Japanese design concepts than I have, because I think they do a fantastic job of creating beauty in small spaces. And personal preference, well, I've had people bring in plants that they thought were beautiful native plants, and I don't care for them. It's individual. It's in the eye of the beholder. So it's not just personal preference. Isn't just about the plants. It's also about the effects that you're trying to create. One of the things I try to create in a garden is season-long bloom. And through trial and error, I find that there are different strategies that I use to achieve that. If you like a verbena or you like an island bush poppy, maybe you can get that season-long bloom in just one or two plants. Sometimes most plants don't bloom that long. A foothill penstemon, for example, I put some in the shade and some in the sun, and the ones in the shade usually bloom later and longer, so it extends the blooming season. Deadheading poppies and a few other plants will extend their blooming season. But with many plants, if you want to get a given color in a given area all season, maybe reds and whites, for example, you need maybe 3 or 4 plants in that same area that gives you that same color in different times of the growing season. So you kind of get your sequence. But I want to talk a little beyond personal preference and these variables. I want to get into some design elements. And one that I think is really important is your sight lines, which is nothing more or less than, I think, your favorite view of certain areas of your garden. And this is important because you build your beauty around those sight lines. The decisions that I make in the wintertime, where I put rocks, where I put plants in relation to one another, all have to do with exactly what I want to see in the spring and summer months. So, and there's other sight lines. A sight line here looking out from my patio out toward our remnant wall. There's another sight line looking across the garden, what I call my open woodland view. There's a sight line over this way looking out at the pond and stream. Sight line out in front, the stream bed area. So there's 5 or 6 sight lines that we have, but you build your beauty around those. You can also enhance the beauty. You can enhance your view. When I think of what I try to do, for example, is slope the landscape upward. Because if I don't do that, I just see the plants in front and maybe the tallest plants. But if I slope it upward, I see more plants and potentially more beauty. And if I go one step farther and slope the view, then I can see even more land and more beauty. So, and you don't have to, it just doesn't have to be when you put in all the new plants. You can be doing that gradually throughout the growing season. I also, from the sightlines, I also use a concept what I call beauty by contrast, or counterpoint. And that means you're using an opposite principle than you usually use and bringing them in at the same time. The principle I like in a garden generally is soft curving lines and flowing effects. But if in the middle of that you put in sharp angles, something like a remnant wall or a bench or something, all of a sudden it's a very different thing, but it can be dramatic in creating beauty. I think another example of counterpoint is taking a horizontal pathway with a horizontal planting bed beyond and making it more interesting by making it a vertical landscape beyond. Bring in rocks and soil and build it up. And it's much more interesting landscape. So these are things I do. Another thing from the Sightline that I like to do, I like to check the beauty every once in a while, because some plants grow larger and some die, and you want to make sure that there's not any huge gaps. I start out, I want to see the overall composition of my view. I look at it as a painting. I want to make sure the composition is good. So what I do is squint, and it blurs out the details, and all I see is the tall shapes and the rounded shapes and the landscape under it. And if I like the composition, then I bring the detail back, and I bring it back under magnification. I take my binoculars and I go view by view all the way across and up high, and then all the way across the middle, and all the way across down lower. And if any of those little views aren't beautiful, I put down the glasses and I think, okay, what could I do differently in that little area? But meanwhile, I realize that these big views have many little beautiful views that are worth seeing. I also believe in beauty through relationship. In other words, we don't just buy a beautiful plant and stick it somewhere. This is where we get away from being eclectic. We tie it into some design. It has to relate to some plant concept that we have for the whole garden. And in native plants, we have the concepts created for us in terms of the plant communities. I think years ago, intuitively, I started to put plants in plant communities. And now there's several good books, really good books, on helping the gardener recognize what plants go into different plant communities. So, and yet, how do you communicate a plant community? Well, the key word is repetition. In the front, I have a chaparral, which is basically a shrubland. So just the repetition of shrubs throughout really gives the feeling of that. And you put the landscape under it, if it's all up and down and rocky terrain, that kind of ties it all together as well. So, and sometimes having the specific plant repeated, specific bloom repeated here and there throughout, ties it together. In the open woodland back here, in the midground, having 10-foot trees with some space in between, kind of creating an open woodland with plants that are different sizes. That can communicate a oneness or relationship. So I think that's an element of beauty, not only in creating a plant community, but in communicating between plant communities. In the front yard, I have a chaparral, a shrubland, and it runs up into a stream bed where I have different types of plants. How do you bring those two together? Well, I don't run shrubs all the way tight down to the stream bed. I have a transition zone of about 10 feet where I put in fewer shrubs, but I bring in some of the streamside plants. So it's kind of a natural merging of two communities. And I do that because that's exactly what I see happening in nature. And we did that in a vertical plane too. Our backyard here, most of the trees are no bigger than about 10 feet tall. However, in the area behind our garden, the trees are 60 or 70 feet tall. So what I've done at the fence line in between those two is put in shrubs that are now about 20 feet tall. So it's a nice smooth upward flow of foliage. So relationship is an important concept of beauty to me. We're talking about January and February. And this is not only the start of a new year, it kicks off what I call my first season of bloom. Coincides with my first season of bloom. And the plants that carry those 2 months for me are Manzanitas and some of the currants. And the two Manzanitas that kick in the most bloom are the Howard McMinn and the Dr. Hurd. It's very profuse. And the currant that blooms fully first is the chaparral currant. And these three plants just create so much wonderful habitat for bees early in the season. It's just neat to see. There's other plants that kick in at the same time. This year we had a Ceanothus rigidus snowball, a nice white blooming Ceanothus. We had a couple of annuals start blooming early. Phacelia viscida, the sticky phacelia, and Phacelia campanularia, which is the desert Canterbury bells. And they were two of the most beautiful blue blooms you can imagine. And so, you know, it's kind of like not winter anymore at that point. But anyway, I guess the main point I've been making as I introduce a few of my favorite elements of beauty is that planning for beauty probably guarantees that you will have more beauty. Anyway, I hope I've given you some thought, and it's been nice having you with me. Thank you very much.